Hello and welcome to another episode of the Rich Reads podcast. Today I have Claire Linney here, who is author of The Travelers, which is a mouthful.
Yes.
And so the first books is Travelers and The Silk Thief, which is a middle grade book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so Time Tub Travelers and the Silk Thief it's a fast-paced time traveling adventure that explores Black British history, so in particular Black Tudor history. And it's about two kids from East London called Zula and Milo who find an antique bathtub in their aunt's antique shop, and she tells them not to go near the gold antique bathtub. But they're 11-year-olds, so what? Like even as an adult, like what are you going to do? You're going to go near the bathtub. The bathtub turns out to be a time machine and strands them over 400 years in the past in Tudor London, where it turns out that the streets of Tudor London are not the safest place for a bunch of 11-year-olds from East London.
And yeah, it is such a fun and, like you said, fast-paced read. When I was reading it, there was like so much going on, and it's like, oh, it just keeps you like you don't want to put it down because like I'm gonna miss something.
Was definitely true. I think one of the things you have to bear in mind, especially writing for this age group, is you want to keep them reading. Like you really want to foster a love of reading. You want to keep them, because I think adults are far more indulgent when it comes to books. Like if things are getting a bit self-indulgent or going off on a track, they'll stick with you. Kids won't. If they
Yeah.
get bored, they're not going to keep reading. They don't owe you anything, I guess, as a writer. So it's why every kind of chapter ends with a sort of a mini cliffhanger. So because I love the idea, I always loved that when I was young, that you didn't want to turn your light out and go to bed, like you had to read another chapter. And that's how I'd love my readers to feel when they're reading the book.
Yeah, and that was exactly how I felt.
Amazing.
And so what drove you to write this specific story?
So I didn't intend to be a children's author. It was I did a creative writing course maybe 20 years ago and thought, oh, that was fun. But I didn't really have any ideas. So I just thought, okay, maybe I'm just not a writer. And then I was on maternity leave. So I had a full-time job. I just had a baby. And I read a book called Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufmann, which is in fact, I've got it here. Hang on. It's all this book's fault, and I've told Miranda Kaufmann, the author, this. But this is a fantastic book, and it goes into the lives of 6 different people of African descent that were living in England during Tudor times. And I think it just slightly blew my mind. I was also, very sleep deprived at the time, so it sort of had this big emotional impact on me, because I had never learnt this stuff at school. So I'd grown up with this idea that Black people were enslaved, and then they arrived in the late 40s in the UK with Windrush. That was sort of the internal narrative I'd been given about people of colour in this country. And I had a vague idea that there was more to it than that. But to read a whole book that was just about Black Tudors,
Mm.
just it literally just sort of set off some kind of, I don't know, chain reaction in my brain. So I started looking for a lot more books on Black British history, and then I started looking at kids books, because I was like, well, this is great for me, but how is this being passed on to the next generation?
Yeah.
And there are some great kids books on Black British history, probably not enough, but there are still some amazing ones. And then I remembered that I hated history at school. I really didn't like it. And I didn't like reading non-fiction, because it felt like someone was trying to teach me something.
Yeah.
Like I was like, oh no, I can see what you're doing here. You're trying to get me to learn, aren't you? But I loved fiction, and I was a really voracious reader. But I loved fantasy and science fiction. I loved Doctor Who growing up. And I thought I wouldn't have read a non-fiction book. So the only way I would have learnt about the idea of Black people as part of Britain's past, is if it had turned up in a fiction book. So then I started looking for those books, and there are a handful. There are a handful, and the ones there are great. But I was like, there are so many books on mermaids and wizards and dragons. How are there not more books bringing some of this sort of Black British history to life in a fictional way? And then I got an earworm of thinking, oh, I could do this. And then I was like, no, no, Claire, you have a toddler and a job. No, you're not doing this. Genuinely, I was sort of sitting down going, this is ridiculous. You are not about to become a children's author. What are you doing? And it literally was an earworm. I couldn't get rid of it. So I ended up writing the ideas down just to get it out of my brain, because I was like, I need this headspace back. And then eventually I sort of admitted to myself that I was starting to write a book, and then that's kind of when it got serious. But I think, yeah, I was as surprised as anyone else. Like, it definitely wasn't part of my life plan, was not to start a very time consuming side hustle as a children's author. So
And I
yeah.
think things like that are very like it's like the universe being like, nope, this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I was really like, and I think I'd, in some ways, you know, because I'm in my 40s now, I've wanted to find like my purpose in life, if that sounds too sort of big and I really enjoyed my job, but I never felt like that was my reason to be, if that makes sense. So in some ways, I was sort of, I've been looking for this for a long time, but when it arrived, I was like, no, 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 this is a terrible timing. This is not happening.
And how did that process? Because not only so you're on maternity leave, you wrote the book, and it's also like it's indie published, so that must have been even more overwhelming.
Yeah, it was a really long process. So I sort of, I think I started, if I remember right, I started outlining the plot right at the end of mat leave, which was just when COVID hit as well. So it was a very weird time. I was sort of just writing stuff down when my son was napping. So I probably spent probably a year writing it, but it was a much shorter book. I was going to aim it at a younger age group. It was probably only 10,000 words. And then I got some feedback from a couple of early readers and a few people I know that sort of, I think primary school teachers. And I think their feedback was actually kids don't really start exploring history at school until they're in like year 4.
Mm.
Which is kind of, so in the UK that's sort of 7, 8 years old. So actually I realized that it probably needed to be for a slightly older age group, so sort of more like 7, 8 year olds and up, and therefore it
Yeah.
needed to be longer. So it kind of went from this very short, simple 10,000 word piece, which I think actually was quite good, because I think if I'd started being like, oh, I need to write 35,000 words, I probably never would have done it. But because it was 10,000 initially, I was like, I can do 10,000 words. But then and then I was like, oh, now I can put in all the stuff that I had to take out or was overcomplicating things. So it was quite enjoyable going from 10 to 30,000 words, weirdly. But it was probably 2 years of writing it, and then probably another year of editing it, as in editing it myself, before I sort of started what's called querying, where you try and get an agent, which is initially how I thought I would start. And I thought, oh, great. Well, I said, it's, you know, because it's about Black British history, I'll send it to some Black children's literary agents, because I feel like they'll really get what I'm trying to do. And I couldn't find any at all. And there are some now, a handful, but this was sort of 3, 4 years ago. I couldn't find a single Black children's literary agent in the UK, which it kind of didn't surprise me, but also shocked me at the same time. And so I was like, okay, fine, I'll just send it out to query. So I probably spent a year sending it out to agents, which is, and I'm sure other authors have told you, this is probably the most soul destroying part of the process, because a lot of the time you get no feedback. It's not like someone saying, okay, well, this is good, but maybe work on this part of your writing or this. You get nothing. So I think at that point, I was like, okay, maybe my writing could be terrible, or maybe the idea just isn't commercial enough, or maybe it's just not what they're. So you don't know. But I think I'd also given it to maybe 4 or 5 kids to read at that point, and a couple of primary school teachers, and their feedback was really great.
Oh, that's cool.
So I was, and my mum's also an English, or she used to be an English teacher. So I was sort of, and my mum kind of doesn't count because she's not going to tell me it's terrible, but you know, but like other primary school teachers. Um, so at that point, I was like, okay, well, I don't think my writing's terrible. I'm getting good feedback, but I'm not getting anywhere in the industry. So I was really disheartened. I was just like, I feel like I put a lot of work into this, and I think because it was like, if I'd just written another fantasy novel about dragons or unicorns, I probably would have given up at that point. But I just had this sort of I don't know, just the overwhelming drive. But like, I think this book has a place. I think it's needed. I think there's a reason why I've written it. And I think that's what kept me going. Maybe slightly arrogantly of being like, this book needs to be in the world. Because I think it's a weird thing being an author. It's, you spend a lot of time doubting yourself and having this crazy imposter syndrome, but you also need this sort of relentless drive that your book absolutely must exist. So it's this weird juxtaposition. You're sort of holding these two contrary opinions of your book and your writing in your mind. It's very weird. But I was very lucky. A friend of mine who is traditionally published, she writes great crime books. A friend of hers is a self-published author, an indie author. It's a wonderful girl called Martha, and she sat down and probably spent 2 hours on the phone with me and just was like, this is how it works. Like, this is what you do. These are the pros and cons. This is what I wish I'd known. These are the places you can go for support. And she kind of walked me through everything I needed to get started. And it's actually, in some ways, the barriers are quite low to entry, as in some ways it's very easy to do, and in other ways, if you want to do it well, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
But there's no gatekeepers. You are the gatekeeper. So
Yeah.
if you're prepared to put in the time, energy, and investment up front, because a lot of it is paying for professional editors and paying for a cover design, that's the thing that takes the time and the investment. But I think when I realized I could do it myself rather than waiting for permission, I was like, oh, this is great. This is exactly. And then I felt very energized because I was like, I can make this happen. And I think up until then, apart from my partner and my mum, no one knew I was writing a book.
Oh, wow.
I had told, because I was like, if I tell, other than the few people I sent it, I was like, if I tell people every time I see them, they're going to be like, how's the book going? When's it being published? And no, I was like, I've got my ego is so fragile for this book. I need to keep it intact, and therefore I need to keep it close. So no one knew. And it was only when I started realizing I was going to do it myself, I was suddenly just casually mentioning people, oh yeah, so the book I'm writing. And everyone was like, what? Sorry, you what? When did this happen? So
It's like,
yeah, that's,
yes. Oh.
they were like, how? Well, you've got a toddler. And I was like, I don't want to talk about it.
And was there anything? Why did you choose a time traveling bathtub specifically?
I'd love to say there was a really well thought out reason for that. So basically, right before my son was born, we had some work done on our house, and part of that was redoing the bathroom. And I said to my partner, I will compromise on anything. Like I said, I don't have a hard line on anything to do with this renovation other than wanting a Victorian bathtub. I was like, I said, it's just, but I don't know why. It's just been a dream. Maybe it was growing up with, like, the avocado green. In fact, no, we had a blue bath, like a blue plastic bathtub when I was growing up. The whole bath suite was blue in the way it was in the 80s. So I've just had this reaction, which is I've just always wanted an antique Victorian bathtub. So we have one now in my bath, and we decided to paint it yellow because someone told us, they said, you can just paint them any color you want. And I said, like any color. So we've got this really like kind of dark yellow Victorian bathtub, and I spent quite a lot of time relaxing during my mat leave when I could in the bath. So at some point that just seemed to make sense, and also because a bathtub's quite you can fit two kids in it.
Yeah.
It's quite a comfortable thing to time travel in. I thought it might be something. I don't know why someone's got an antique bathtub in an antique shop. I hadn't really thought that through, but there is one. So yeah, I think that's where that came from. But it's quite funny. It's something I talk to kids quite a lot about when I go into school. So we talk about using time travel as a storytelling device because it's a really fun way of exploring historical fiction, as
Yeah.
Doctor Who kind of shows, because you see it, obviously you're seeing it through modern eyes. But I asked them, we talk about different time machines. They recognize the TARDIS. Most of them recognize the DeLorean from Back to the Future, which really gives me hope for the next generation. I love that 9-year-olds know
Yeah.
what Back to the Future is. But we talk about, are there any rules in films or books about what can be a time machine? And pretty much like a mirror can be a time machine. I always say to them, one of the chairs in your class might be a time machine. And if you go back to your classroom and wriggle around on your chair too much, you might accidentally find yourself traveling back in time. And then if I've ever said that in a classroom, it literally half the class immediately starts checking to see if their chair is in fact a time machine. So yeah, it's quite fun. We talk about all the different things in a room that could be a time machine and how you could accidentally activate them and go back in time.
And I definitely feel like it adds that bit of like quirkiness that I think younger books do have. Like, I feel like a lot of younger books don't need explanations for everything
No,
because it's like the little kids will just believe it and that's it, that's good. So, why can't a bathtub be a time machine?
exactly. And I think kids are very willing to suspend their disbelief if it makes sense with the context you're creating. So if you tell them that a bathtub will travel in time, they're like, great, they're not going to start asking you for details on quantum physics. Um, Generally, I have had a couple questions. I definitely have had questions from a year six about the theoretical and practical possibilities of time travel. But generally speaking, very happy that the bathtub travels. And I think also from my perspective, I think writing a historical fiction book would have felt very daunting. I didn't like history at school. I didn't study history. I studied biology. I think I would have felt like I didn't have the credentials to write historical fiction. But which I think is just that was just an internal blocker for me. But somehow because it was time travel, obviously I'm not writing historical fiction. I'm writing science fiction. Therefore,
Yeah,
even though I had to do just as much research, but I think it gave me a pass, and it made it seem more accessible. And I think also for this age group, it can also be a slightly more accessible entry into reading historical fiction. It's a little, I like to describe the book as sort of the literary equivalent of sneaking vegetables into your kid's tomato sauce. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a time traveling bathtub, there's child catchers, there's a giant snake, but they're also learning a lot about Tudor history and Black British history. But I've kind of, that's the vegetables. I've smuggled that in.
yeah, definitely. And how much research did go into it? Because like it is, fiction, but it's based on like some real historical figures.
So quite a lot. In fact, probably more. The second one, which is coming out in April, is Victorians, and that there was a lot of googling involved. But for Tudors, so Miranda Kaufmann's book Black Tudors was a lot of the information about reasonable Blackman, who was a black silk weaver living in Southwark, and he's the sort of real black historical figure that the kids meet when they're in Tudor London. There's a fantastic series of books called, I think it's called A Time Traveller's Guide to, and then different periods of British history. So there's a Time Traveller's Guide to Renaissance Britain. So it's written a little bit like A Lonely Planet, but for this particular era. But that was just really good in terms of the types of foods, society, people's attitudes, what it was like going to London. So that's how I found out that London smelt incredibly bad in Tudor time, so much so that people visiting from abroad would write these huge letters home complaining or describing the
Wow.
terrible smell. Like it was almost a physical thing. So that was really useful for sort of the small bits. And then I can't remember, I read a couple of other books set in that time period, sort of other historical fiction books, and also did a lot of research online. But it's sort of when you're editing, you sort of find yourself writing something and you're like, huh, what did they have on the floors inside houses and shoot, like, so there's a lot of just like really annoying detail when you're like, oh, hang on, did they have glass in windows? Like, and what are the candles made of? And so it's just it's checking really small details, because even though it's not a fact book, I was like, if kids are reading this and they're getting facts from this, I want them to be the right facts.
Yeah.
So at one point I was like, oh, they're going to eat sandwiches, and I was like, oh, hang on, I'm pretty sure sandwiches weren't invented. So then I was like, okay, when were sandwiches invented? And there's a lot for, there's a crazy amount of stuff for the Victorian one, because it's even things like because it's set in the Victorian circus, um, but it was things like how did they do tightrope walking? Did they have safety nets in Victorian times? Did a lot of people actually died in the circus in Victorian times, because although safety nets existed, they didn't use them. But also things like, I started getting into Victorian vernacular and slang, but things like I'd written one of the Victorian characters saying hello, and they didn't say hello until the invention of the telephone. So the word hello was literally created. I think it was a toss up between whether people said ahoy or hello when they answered the phone, and they went with hello, which is a shame. Ahoy would have been great. But therefore, you can't have a Victorian character saying hello or okay. And even things like I said, oh, piece of cake. And then I was like, when did we start? And annoyingly, so many phrases started being used at the beginning of the, like, sort of in the 1900s. And I'm like, 50 years too late.
And because you don't usually think about those things.
No, don't write historical fiction on it. I was like, why? But it was crazy things. Like I swear I spent a whole day researching printing presses, because there's a bit in the story which involves a printing press. And my editor has said, hang on, wouldn't this been a man operated printing press and not an automatic? So I literally spent a whole day researching exactly when they'd had steam powered printing presses, at what point they'd been developed, at what point they'd been popular, at what point they might have arrived in Leeds, which was where so it was a whole day of research for what is literally 2 paragraphs in the book. And I was like,
Oh,
this is ridiculous. I was like, I can now write a book on the development of the printing press in the mid 1800s of the UK, but this is unhelpful. So yeah, there's a lot of that.
and in the first book, like you said, you had reasonable Blackman as the
Yes.
historical figure. Um, how do you pick your like main historical figure for the books?
So there were kind of 6 to choose from. So there, in terms of the idea came from Black Tudors, Miranda Kaufmann's book, and she goes into the lives of 6 different Black Tudors. And I think what really appealed to me about Reasonable Blackman was he was just kind of an ordinary bloke. So she also talks a lot about John Blank, John Blank, who was a trumpeter in the court of Henry VII and Henry VIII. There's a picture of him on this famous painting called the Westminster Scroll. But I kind of feel like John Blank is, as much as there is a poster boy for Black Tudors, I kind of feel like John Blank is the poster boy. And also it's set in the court of Henry VIII, and I feel like we've done Henry. There's so many stories about Henry VIII. So I didn't really want to write about the royal court. I sort of wanted it set in just like everyday Tudor London. And I liked the fact that Reasonable Blackman was kind of a tradesman, but he had this skilled profession. And there was also this really lovely connection with the theatres. So he lived in Southwark, which is sort of where Waterloo Station is, just south of the River Thames. It's where the Globe Theatre is now built, but it's also where the original theatres that showed Shakespeare's plays were built in London. And Shakespeare was alive at the same time. So even though we don't know for sure, it's likely that the cloth he was weaving would have been used for costumes in the theatre. And that was a really lovely idea. And that kind of comes into the book. So I think there were just lots of little details. We're like, oh, I can see how this could make a really interesting story. But I think it was partly just because he wasn't a character that was changing the course of history or was insignificant. He was just a bloke. And I thought that's kind of what I want to get across, that no, there weren't like hundreds of thousands of Black people in Tudor London, but they were just part of everyday life. They were just ordinary people. So that, I think that's the message I wanted to convey with that, with the choice of him.
Yeah, and that's like I think that's like a really good thing because like a lot of people, like the majority of people are just everyday people. So it has that representation, and because like you don't hear a lot about like it is all about when you look back at historical stuff and stuff, it's a lot of in the court and all that,
Yes.
and you don't hear about the like everyday life and everything.
Yeah. So I think that's, although having said that, I've sort of broken my own rules, because the choice for the second book is Pablo Fanque, who was a hugely popular circus owner of the Victorian age. But I think the reason I chose him, other than it's circus, so
Yeah.
it was like, who doesn't want to write about the Victorian circus? But I feel like he should be really well known and really famous because he had this extraordinary life, and he's very he's mentioned in a Beatles song.
Oh wow.
So there's a song called "For the Benefit of Mr. Kite," because John Lennon found a poster, an old circus poster featuring Pablo's circus. But aside from that, he's not a well-known historical figure, even amongst kind of black historical figures. And I feel like his story needs the Greatest Showman treatment. So I think that was why I was really drawn to him for the second book.
Yeah, and having it based like circus based is going to be like really fun.
Yeah, because there's just, there's a lot of jeopardy, or like automatically, I'm like, I don't have to create a lot of jeopardy. We're in the circus, like stuff's gonna happen.
Yeah, definitely. Um, and so you write the middle grade more. So the characters are in year six.
Yes, so which is the
Yes.
top year of primary school in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, are your books going to kind of like stay in that age, or are the characters like going to grow as the books go on, or do you have a plan for that?
A little bit. It's one of these things you make up retrospectively to justify the choices you've made. So the second book is a little bit, it's about a third longer. And it's a little more complex. So the first book I sort of said was great for 7 years and up. This one's more 8 years and up. So so Zula and Milo was sort of in year 7 now, so they're sort of 12 years old. But I think that's probably where they're going to stay. I'm not going to have them age older
Yeah.
because then you start getting into young adult, and then it becomes a very different type of story. Um, so they've got a tiny. They've kind of gone from the end of year 6. I had this all mapped out somewhere, I think, and what month things were in. I think they've gone from the sort of spring term year 6 to autumn term year 7, I think is what I decided. But then the third book, which will be the final book, will be set quite close to the second book. So yeah, they won't age really much beyond that.
Mm. And do you promote a lot of middle grade and younger books on your socials and stuff? Is that kind of like your main age genre, or do you just like read everything?
I read everything, but it's interesting because I hadn't read books for this age group really since I was this age. And then obviously when I started looking for comparative books, when I started writing, I was like, oh, I need to start reading middle grade books because if I'm going to write for this audience, I need to start reading it. And I've always been a big reader. I've always read a huge amount. So I started reading middle grade books, and I was like, these are amazing. I was like, why are all grown-ups not reading middle grade? I was genuine because I thought I was reading them because I needed to. I think I was so delighted by them, and I was like, yeah, I really loved reading them. So I think there was about a year where I stopped reading adult books because I was like, well, these are shorter, keep your attention more, and also I think children's books will always end in hope and positivity, like strength wins, resilience wins, kindness wins. And you
Yeah.
can't say that for adult books. Like adult books will take you to a very dark emotional place and are quite happy to leave you there.
Yeah.
Whereas kids' books will tackle all those big subjects, but they will always lead you out.
Mm.
So I think there's something, and a lot of people write comments on my posts. I get a lot of adults saying if I'm in a difficult place in my life, or if I'm feeling down, or if I get in a reading slump, or it's almost like using middle grade books as therapy in a way because they just seem to they're kind of nurturing
Yeah.
without shying away from big, difficult, quite intense emotional topics a lot of the time. So I think I now read probably I'd say 40% of the books I read, 40 to 50% are middle grade, partly because of the writing, but partly just because I love them. And if you told me I couldn't read them anymore, I don't know what I would do. I think if you made me choose between adult books and middle grade books, I think I could cope without reading adult books. I genuinely now don't think I could cope without reading middle grade books. I don't think I would be as nice a person. I think it makes me I genuinely think it makes me more empathetic as a person.
Yeah.
But I do still read adult books, and I started reading young adult books as well. Um, which I think I've worked out the reason I love young adult books so much right now is escapism, because I think when you get to like this is my theory. I think when you get to like 19, 20, you're so keen to start reading like grown-up books, like adult books about adults, adulting, because kids always want to be older. I think now I'm in my 40s, I'm like, I have too much adulting. Like I have too much actual adulting to deal, like bills, and like I want to read books with teenagers in because they don't have to deal with mortgages and
Yeah.
childcare and the approaching perimenopause. Do you know what I mean? It's just like and it's kind of it's sort of it's really nice to kind of feed my inner 16-year-old, I think, in that way. So and there's a lot of amazing kind of young adult dystopia and young adult fantasy, which I particularly love. So that's the kind of balance. So I read some young adult, some adult, and then the majority is probably middle grade. But I try and it's nice that I think I like to change it up because I think you get different things from each age group.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm like, when I'm in a reading slump, yeah, I'm either like, my three tips are you read fanfic, you read a middle grade, or you read a book that you've already read and you loved.
Yeah,
Just because it's
definitely.
all easier. And I just like, even like I tell my mom all the time, I'm like, I just think middle grade is more fun.
Yeah, there's
And
like
like, there's got to be
yeah,
a lot of skill in it too, in the sense that like, you have, you still have to get all this emotion and all these like complex ideas, but you have to do it in a way that's a younger person can understand it. Like when
yeah.
you're doing more adult or even like young adult, the people reading it, the target audience, are more knowledgeable about the things, and so they can just be like, oh yeah, but you've got to kind of explain it more, but in a nice, simple, easy way.
Yeah, exactly. And she's that's I completely agree. And there's a really wonderful kids author called Catherine Rundell who wrote a book called Impossible Creatures. She's written lots of books. She writes she's a John Donne scholar, so she's a very like scholarly academic, and she writes some adult books, but she predominantly writes kids books. But she's also written essays and books on why you should read children's books even though you're so old and wise. But she talks a lot about the fact that children's books aren't lesser than adult
Mm,
books, they're concentrated. And actually, just because they're shorter and for a younger age group doesn't make them easier to write or less worthy of consideration, I think is a lot of what she says.
mm,
And she makes a really good point that there are a lot of very well thought of classic adult authors who couldn't write kids books for shit, who tried and failed quite spectacularly because their children's books were awful. So just because you are a fantastic writer doesn't mean you can automatically write children's fiction. But yeah, some of her essays around the topics are really interesting. And she also talks about the fact, I think, that kids books are the only books that have truly universal appeal, because young adult books don't, because of their age range, adult books don't. But I think in the same way that Pixar films have universal appeal
yeah,
and Disney films, and we think when we and I think people are far more willing to accept that from films in a way than
yeah,
they are from books. Like adults will be fine saying, oh, I loved Moana too, it was amazing. But then you ask them to read a middle grade book and they're like, well, that can't resonate with me because it's for a 10-year-old.
yeah.
Whereas I kind of think his books, especially the best ones, have that ability to have a universal appeal in a way that almost no other age group can.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting too because like a lot of adults still read and enjoy YA. So like I don't
Yes.
understand how you can't apply that same logic to middle grade and younger.
No, and I actually think middle grade is more accessible in a way because I love young adult, but I think as an adult, there's always a point where you're just like, really, is this what they're going to do next? Like, what?
Yeah.
Why have you not just gone and told them? Do you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
there's an element of being a teenager, and why they're all up in their heads because that's what it is to be a teenager. But I think as an adult, you start to think that is not how I would have dealt with that situation. Like, what is happening? But
Just
you
like, just
should,
talk to each other.
yes, just talk to each other and sort it out. And I feel that's why a lot of adults don't enjoy YA, because they find that whole inner just emotional 11 whatever a little bit too much, and you don't actually get that so much in middle grade. There's almost like there's a layer of rationality that disappears for teenagers but sort of exists up until the age of 12, weirdly. So I think in some ways actually I would recommend that adults read middle grade rather than young adult, because I think it's actually more universal in some ways because of that.
I also think that middle grade has a lot more diverse stories. and
Yes.
it's like more accessible for them to be traditionally published as well, um, compared to your more adult and YA books, which is unfortunate. Um, but I do really like that in the aspect of, teaching kids from a young age. They're all different people with all different things. Everyone's different and it's all good.
Yeah, well, I read a really interesting book a while ago, which it's a kind of how you I think it's called "We Wish We Knew What to Say." So it's talking to children about race at different ages. But I was quite surprised. There's been quite a lot of studies that show by the age of 9, kids have quite fixed views of their identity, their place in the world in relation to sort of other people. So actually, once they get over the age of 9, and especially once they're in their teens, it's much harder to challenge their worldview. It's much easier below up to the age of 9 because they're just more open to ideas and concepts, and they haven't quite fixed things quite as much, which was part of the reason I didn't write a young adult book, that I was always going to write a kids book. But I think it's why children's literature is so important to, represent autistic kids and queer kids and black and brown kids and history, and because the older they get, the harder it is
Yeah,
to really cement that in their consciousness. And once people are adults, it gets really hard.
yeah.
So
And do you have any advice for writers that want to write middle grade books?
read a lot of them. Like, just, yeah. And it sounds like a really obvious thing, but I follow a couple of literary agents. There's one particular literary agent I follow on TikTok, and she said that she's had meetings with people. So she's kind of said she's interested in their query. They've gone to the first meeting stage, and she said, "Oh, which children, other children's authors inspire you, or what's the books you're reading at the moment?" And they go, "Oh, I don't read kids' books." And she's like, at that point, she's like, "I'm never taking on that client." Because, like, if they're
Yeah,
serious about writing children's literature and they're not reading it, even if they can write it miraculously, she's like, that's a hard no. So I think you really want to understand the breadth and depth of children's literature, because it's amazing. But also, I don't understand how you could write for an age group that you're not engaged with reading what they're reading.
yeah, that's a very confusing logic with that.
Yeah, but there it's amazing. There genuinely are people like, oh, I want to, and because I think sometimes people think, oh, I want to write a kids book because it's shorter and easier. It's shorter. I wouldn't say it's easier necessarily. Um, but I think you've really, like, do it because you really love children's literature and you're really passionate about wanting to write for that age group. Also because it is hard. Don't do it for the fame and the money. Like, I know there are some very famous, very wealthy children's authors, but most authors don't make a living, unfortunately, from their books. I think it's 19% in the UK,
Oh, wow.
and 2% probably make a very good living. And so it's,
Yeah.
the chances of you making money are small. It takes up a lot of time. So you've really got to want to do it. Like, don't do it for the fame or the money, because no, this is not the easy route to either fame or money. But I think if you talk to most children's authors, they're really passionate about wanting to write great stories for children, and that's why they do it. They're also some of the loveliest people you'll ever meet. I've never met a children's author that isn't a really lovely human being. I think that's because we read kids books all the time. That's my theory. So I
Um,
think that's my top tip: read lots and write for kids because you really want to, not because you think that's an angle.
and one thing that always pops into my mind when I think of like authors writing middle grade, do you have any tips for like getting into that like voice and stuff? Because clearly these are adults writing, and it's been
Yes.
a long time, and some longer than others, since they've been that age. So how do you tackle that?
That's a really hard one. That's probably something I did quite automatic. Like, in terms of, there are things I definitely need to work on with my writing. From what my editors tell me, that's not one of them. I think because I read a lot of it, but you have to try and, I guess you just have to try and see things from a 9 or a 10-year-old's perspective. And it's really interesting now going into schools and talking to them, because I hadn't at this point. I had a 2-year-old. it's impossible to try and understand anything from a 2-year-old's perspective. You would just rip up your manuscript and go and sulk in a corner and never finish anything. But I think you have to try and tap into that mindset. So I think it's trying to apply a level of curiosity to the world, because I think as adults we think we know everything, whereas kids are almost, they're very curious, they're very interested, but they also will question stuff that they don't understand, and they will challenge things, and they will naturally get, I don't know if you ever remember that sense of injustice you used to feel as a kid, if you felt
Yeah.
you've been wronged or something, someone had done something they shouldn't have done, or you've been accused of something you knew you didn't do. There was, you get this really fiery sense of injustice, and it's, but also just asking a million questions about something. So I think it's trying to tap into those elements that you have as a child that you sort of lose a little bit as an adult.
Yeah.
But also not talking down to kids. I think you're talking to them, but you're not talking down at them. So I think that's a mistake some people make, is that they feel like they're dumbing things down or condescending, and you've got to write for kids at their level, and they're
Yeah.
actually capable of understanding a lot more than I think adults give them credit for. So even sometimes with language, sometimes I will use a word and I'm like, is a 9-year-old going to understand what that word means? And I'm like, do you know what? As long as it's not every word, it's fine to throw in words like that, especially if the context makes it clear what that word means.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes I get feedback from my beta read. Oh no, this was actually feedback from a parent saying my child is now using this word in conversation because she read it in your book and understood what it meant. So there's an element of, you can use more sophisticated language in places in the right way, as long as you make it clear. Kids can kind of infer what it means.
Yeah. Because like I just took me back. But like, yeah, when you're back in primary school and they're like, I remember a teacher like explaining how you can tell if a book is at like your reading level, and it's like, well, if you come across like less than 10 words on a page or something that you don't know, then that's okay. But if it's more, then that's probably a bit too much for you at the moment and stuff like that. So, and that's how kids learn vocabulary as well.
Yeah. So I don't think you should. I mean, obviously, I'm not writing Jane Austen-esque prose, because I think it's that balance between, you want kids to just be able to keep reading it. You don't want them to trip up.
Yeah.
You want them to be able to have that flow and kind of immerse themselves. So you just have to kind of pick when and where you do it. And the best way of doing that is to give your work to kids to read, because one of the wonderful things about having kids as your readers is they will tell you exactly what they think. They're not. It's not like adults where they're aware that they may be crushing your hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
They
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 don't care. They
really
can be brutal.
they I mean if I showed you some of some of the feedback I got on the first book, was one of the kids just written, there are no pictures in here, I'm not interested. I was like, great. But it was interesting because for the first book, quite a lot of the comments that I got were, I really enjoyed this book, but I thought the beginning was a bit boring, or the beginning was a bit slow, or it took a bit of time to get into the action. So I restructured quite a lot of that was the biggest change I made, was rewriting, and it still wasn't like exactly where I'd have wanted, but it was a lot better than it had been. So it was a lot more fast paced. It got into the action. It just got into things sooner, whereas it was a little bit more pedestrian, I think, in early drafts. So that was one of the biggest things I changed, in response to kind of feedback from, like, I think it was 8 to 10 year olds I got feedback from. So it is really important to get feedback from the age reader you're writing for, and to be prepared to change things. I mean, not everything, but if things are coming up with like 3 or 4 or 5 readers, you're like, okay, well, this is not just one kid's opinion. This is something that definitely could be doing this. This could do with a change. So yeah, that's always really, really interesting. And because if they find it boring, I always say, like, which bits did you find boring, and they will tell you.
And did much change in your like writing process from book one to book two?
Yeah, so book two was a bit more planned, in that, because book one kind of evolved from like this shorter version to a longer version. I am not what's called a pantster. So I don't know who gave them names, but there's two schools. two general approaches. I mean, there's lots of approaches, but pansters sit down with a blank page and just start to write and see where the story goes. The idea of doing that terrifies me. I don't have a lot of time to redraft and rewrite things. Because of just life and having now my son's nearly 6 now, so I need to know what I'm writing before I start. So I spreadsheet the crap out of it, which sounds I hate doing the spreadsheet. It's basically called a book map, but it's literally every kind of scene slash chapter. It's like, okay, where is it set? Broadly, what's happening in this chapter? But I think what's really important is I kind of write down what's happening with the protagonist. Like, how is this helping them reach their goal or stopping them from reaching their goal? What do they not know at the beginning that they find out at the end? And then it's all I've got columns for the different themes and how they come in, and what questions are you raising in this chapter that you're not answering that need to be answered later. So I mean, after about the third draft, the plan goes out the window because things have changed, but that enables me to at least understand. And so I think about things a lot in my head, then I write this very complex map, and then I start writing, and I basically try not to stop. So once, I think it's, some people call it a vomit draft.
Yeah.
So I don't edit the first draft at all. I'm like, I know where I'm going, I know what's happening, and then the idea is just to get from chapter 1 to the end of the book without stopping, as much as possible. So like, if I'm like, oh, suddenly like I need to do some research here, or I literally just write research Victorian lion tamers later. And then like a month later, I'm like, I did no research on Victorian lion tamers. I need to look at, like, at one point, like the thing I was most worried about in the second book was writing the show. So I'd written like, add the show in here. And then I left that for a really long time. And then I came back to it. I was like, I really need to write that chapter now, because I've been putting it off for a really long time. So that's my general process. I like telling kids about that, which horrifies their teachers, because I'm like, I don't worry about grammar or spelling or punctuation. So yeah, my first drafts, they're not terribly written, but they usually have no commas, for example. I write
Yeah.
without commas, and then the commas have to come in
Yeah, you got
later.
to get the creative juices flowing, and then you can add all the important grammar and structure and everything.
Yeah, I think it's just I need to figure out where everything's going before I start writing. I think if I just started, I think it would take me too long to get where I need to be. And I like a spreadsheet. I'm a very organized person, so I think the spreadsheet is my kind of creative crux, if that makes sense. Once I have that, I feel like then I can start writing, because there's some kind of plan.
And last year, your book won the best debut novel at the Ink Book Prize Awards. How did that feel?
That was lovely. It can be really hard being an indie author, because there's so many things that other traditionally published authors do and get invited to and get that you don't. So it can feel a lot of the time like there are a lot of gatekeepers just saying no. So a lot of prizes and awards you can't even enter if you're self-published, or weirdly some you can enter if you're self-published, but not if you've sold too many books. So like one of them, I was like, I've sold too many books to be eligible for. I don't understand that. Like,
Isn't that a good thing?
yeah, it was weird. So and so actually, when there are opportunities to get recognition as an indie author, it does mean a huge amount. So the Ink Book Prize is just for self-published authors. And it was the first year it was running. So it's run by two fantastic women called Helen and Abiola, who also run the Diverse Book Awards in the UK. So yeah, that was really lovely. And it just felt like, I mean, I know awards aren't the be all of end all, but it just felt like, okay, you've done a good job and someone has
Yeah.
recognized the work that's gone into it. And so yeah, that was really lovely. It meant a huge amount. I have, every time I'm feeling like I've got imposter syndrome, I'm like, look at the award. Look at the award. So yeah, there we go.
Oh, that's incredible. And do you know how many books you're planning for the series?
3. The only reason I'm stopping at 3 is because I've now got other earworms about other I thought this earworm was just this, that I would do this and then go back to my normal life. No, it turns out I am a children's author now, and I have 6 other earworms in various
Oh,
notes. Like I wish I didn't. The problem is I get very excited about it for a month, and I furiously write loads of notes about it for a month, and and that's all I think about. And then a new idea comes along, and that one gets forgotten, and then it's all. So I have all these sort of like forgotten children of ideas in my phone that need. But there's a couple that I really want to write that I feel really excited about. So I think the third book is going to be, which is going to be Romans. So I can say that it's the third
ooh.
one is Romans, because it felt like, tent poles of British history. I've done Victorians, done Tudors. It felt like, and also I think people don't think of Roman Britain as being a diverse, multicultural place, but it was. And there was an African Roman emperor called Severus Septimus, who was in York for a few years and died. So he wasn't black in the way that we would think of black people being black now. He was from North Africa, so he probably looked quite fair skinned, but he was an African emperor.
Mm.
And there is a certain amount of evidence of lots of North Africans in England during the Roman Empire, but also some people from even sub-Saharan Africa who were sort of described as Ethiops, who would have had darker skin. There were lots of Syrians in the Roman army that were based. So actually, Roman York would have been quite a multicultural place, because that it was reflecting the Roman Empire. So I kind of want to bring that to life in the book. Also, Romans. Who doesn't want to read a book? Again, it's like it's a fun time period.
And these other earworms, will they still have the same themes of like Black history and all that, or?
Yes, and some of them no, because I think there's an element of I do love fantasy, fantasy and sci-fi, and dystopia. Those are my favorite genres. So I definitely have an itch to want to write in those genres, but just put black kids in them, but not make it about
Yeah.
anything particular. But there is an idea that is sort of, I do have a weird idea that is sort of tenuously linked to highlighting sort of black activism in the part. It's very weird. I need to think with that, but that is the idea I'm most interested in writing next. So we'll see where that goes.
And are they planned for like that same age range, or?
Yeah, same age range. I do have a young adult idea, but I'm a little daunted about writing young adult. Just because it's longer. No, I don't think it's because it's harder. It's just like it's twice as many words to get wrong. I think is what I'm thinking. Although actually, do you know what? It's interesting because I think there's definitely a move in the industry to wanting shorter books at the moment, and that's been driven by the price of paper has gone up massively. So it's just more expensive to make longer books. So I do think, and actually, I love a novella. I think it
Mm.
takes an enormous amount of skill to craft, especially fantasy, into 200 pages rather than 1400 pages.
Yeah.
And that is a slight criticism. I do love Brandon Sanderson's work, but the books are so long. Do you know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
think, so yeah, I've got a young adult, but I feel like I need to develop as a writer before I have the confidence to go and do that. And I think also I love, there's something lovely about writing middle grade. I'll have to go to a much darker place if I start writing YA. I'm not sure I'm there right now.
And do you have a favorite book that you tend to recommend people?
Such a hard question to actually. Do you know what I'm going to recommend? Because it's I have, like, I don't know if you can see this. This is my
Oh.
monthly reads had their own shelf because I have too many books. This is not a good thing. Um, but I read this. Someone had recommended this book to me quite a few times, and I was like, okay. And I got it from the library, and I loved it so much. I bought my own copy on Vinted. Also because this is just beautiful. But this is City of Stolen Magic. So this is by Nazneen Ahmed Patak, and I don't know if you've ever read Babel by Rebecca Kwong.
It's on
So
my list.
So Babel is this amazing kind of dark academia book. It's won loads of awards. It's incredibly well thought of. This is the middle grade equivalent to Babel. So basically, it's set in India and India in 1855, and it's about this girl called Chompa who has the ability to do magic with her fingers. Her mother does magic by writing it down. So there's this sort of really interesting magical system. But her mum says she can't do finger magic because she'll put herself in danger. Anyway, her mum then gets kidnapped and taken away, and Chompa has to travel from India to London. So she ends up in Victorian London trying to track down her mum. But there's this whole sinister plot afoot. But it talks about British colonialism. It talks about the impact of empire in terms of what that did to farmers in India and culture. And it kind of uses the magical system as a proxy for how the English were oppressing and trying to control the Indian population. But it also gets into the presence of Indians living in Victorian England. So it's just, but also you've got this amazing girl who's just fierce, and she's kind of a bit arrogant at the beginning, but she's sort of fierce and stubborn and hopeful and brave and is just trying to save her mum. It's also heartbreaking in the same way that Babel, it's such a weird comparison to Babel, because I was reading this thinking, wow, she's actually like taken a lot of the themes of that very complex adult book and represented them really amazingly in a middle grade book. But yeah, I just thought this was really sensational. Like, I was gripped. And apparently there's a sequel, I think, coming out at some point this year, which I'm really looking forward to. So yeah, this is just one of those books that really grabbed me this year that I particularly love. But it's really hard for me. There are so many books. I have my books that oh, actually, hang on, this is one more. This is Birdie by J.P. Rose. So this is set in the 1950s in Yorkshire. And Birdie is mixed race, which I think is why it particularly resonates with me, being mixed race myself. But it's based on a real piece of Black British history. So there was a children's home that was set up after the Second World War for mixed race babies. So they were kids whose mum was white, but dads were Black GIs who'd come over during the Second World War, got women pregnant, had gone home. And then the women were quite often forced to put the children into care or give them up for adoption because they were brown babies, essentially, and their families thought it was a scandal. So she's grown up in this home, but then her great aunt finds out about her and offers her a chance to come and live with her. And her great aunt doesn't find out that she's brown until she turns up. And then it's
Oh,
about
wow.
what happens to this mixed race girl in this kind of close knit Yorkshire community. And she also finds a pit pony, so a pony down the mines, and they form a friendship. But this book is just, it's very beautiful. It's beautifully written. It's this wonderful friendship. But things like the great aunt's journey that she goes on in kind of accepting her great niece nearly broke me in places. So yeah, this is a stunning book. So that book has a very special place in my heart.
And just to touch on quickly with that, in your personal experience of like being a reader and being a writer, how would you describe the importance of representation in literature, especially in middle grade books?
It's really important, and I think I part of why for me reading kids books now is such a joy is I didn't read a single kids book growing up that featured anyone who looked like me, because I grew up in the 80s and they're really were so, Mallory Blackman was a really popular author, but her books really only became popular in the 90s, so I missed them. So when I started reading, I get quite emotional when I read books that have Black girls in them. There's a wonderful superhero series where called Onyeka and the Academy of the Sun, where Onyeka's superpower is her afro hair. And I literally started crying at one point reading the book, and it's because I hated my hair growing up. I just wanted long blonde straight hair because that's what I saw. I grew up without a real sense of pride of being Black or mixed race. I was quite apologetic about it. I even used to describe myself as a cultural coconut, like I'm Black on the outside but white on the middle, in a way to almost apologize for it. And
Yeah.
I only started realizing the problem of how problematic it was that I was describing myself that way in the last couple of years. But I think if I'd seen myself represented in books, and especially in the genre that I'd loved, I would have had a much more positive relationship with my heritage, with the color of my skin, with the texture of my hair. And I think I've got there, but it's taken me I think, it took me into my 30s and 40s to get there, rather than having had that my whole life. So I think it's really important for kids who are black and brown to see themselves, but it's also important for all kids because, especially in the UK, we live in a very diverse country. There are huge amounts of diversity in the societies and peoples. And I think having an understanding and an awareness of that and empathy for different people's viewpoints and experiences and struggles is really, really important. And I think it's so important that kids have that empathy.
Yeah.
Um, but the representation, I mean, it's so much better than it was in the 80s. It's not where it needs to be. And there was a report that's done every year by the Centre of Literacy that they look at the representation and quality of representation of children's literature in the UK. And there have been some steady improvements since, I think they started it in 2017, where 1% of books had a black or brown protagonist in the books that are published that year. I think it went up to 14% in 2022 is having a main character that was black or brown, and then that halved in 2023. It went back down to 7%. So it's not just a guarantee, like there's not enough being done, and the publishing industry is certainly in this country is still very white overwhelmingly. So the publishing industry is not diverse, the agents are not diverse, the marketing companies are not diverse, the booksellers and librarians. So there needs to be representation through all layers. But even with, I'd say, bookstagrammers and book talkers as well, especially when it comes to children's books, a lot of them do an amazing job, but there aren't many black children's bookstagrammers in the UK, for example. So, and unfortunately, a lot of the marketing budgets that push out kids books to the most influencers with the like beautiful PR boxes, and or who pay for content to be created, tend to be white authors. They're very rarely black or brown authors. So yeah, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So that's why I fly my flag militantly in the corner. Because things are improving, but just I wish they were improving faster, and things were a little bit more ingrained. I think there's a little bit too much tokenism that happens at the moment without fundamentally changing things at the level they need to be changed at. But I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful.
Yeah, I'm always a big representation is like big for me. I love seeing it in all books and everything, especially yeah, the younger books and like for people that share that, seeing themselves, but also for people to see just the different variety of people. Like there was a book that I read, which was like a new adult YA, where the main character had the same disability as my best friend, and just to have that, seeing it from a different viewpoint and
Yeah.
stuff like that, it made me feel closer to my best friend. And it was just, and because books also, like that's one of the things that studies have shown that reading fiction can increase your empathy and everything. And so
Absolutely.
it's just, yeah, it is great to see more. And of course, a lot more needs to be done. And it is really sad and disheartening to see that things aren't um, given the same opportunity, even with other authors that I've interviewed. Like one author was writing a book about a group of mums, and she was rejected because someone was like, "Oh no, no one wants to read a story about mums." And I'm like, "Well, if you don't give them the chance, how do you know?"
Well, because I work in marketing for a living, and because I've heard anecdotally that historical fiction isn't seen as hugely commercial in children's literature, especially if it's British history, because it's harder to sell to lots of other European countries. So, and look, the publishing industry needs to make money. I get it, but there's an element of sometimes if you back it, you make it a thing. And I think sometimes the publishing industry is lazy. They just want the thing that's like the other thing that's selling well. And sometimes, no one knew the iPhone was going to revolutionize the phone industry until it did. So part of me is like, I understand what you're saying, but if you don't decide to back something, it will never be a thing. So
Yeah,
sometimes you've just got to, and the feedback I get from kids and teachers, I know they enjoy reading my book. And I know that it works well with classes. So I'm like, you can tell me you don't think the idea is commercial, but evidence that I've had personally would slightly disprove that. So yeah, but look, unfortunately, as in all industries, publishing is driven by money, so you're always battling that. But I think it is hard for authors from marginalized groups, because there's an element of, companies will say, oh well, we had a book with an autistic character and it didn't sell, so therefore we don't want any more. Or we've had a book with a black character and that didn't. And it's like, well, you had a book with a white author that didn't sell, you didn't therefore stop with. Do you know what? It's
Yeah.
just and you have this weight of responsibility if suddenly your book becomes representative of the whole group. So
Yeah.
yeah, there is yeah, I do hear a lot of that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We've had such a great chat. Where can everyone find you and your books?
So Instagram. I'm also on TikTok. I talk a lot more about YA and adult books on TikTok, but I do talk a lot about middle grade books. But Instagram is definitely the best place. And then so this is the first book we've been talking about. It's a weird thing as an indie author, because I don't buy other people's books from Amazon. But kind of the best place to buy indie authors' books quite often is the Evil website, because of the algorithm overlords, really honestly. But also you can recommend it from so local bookshops can order this through their usual channels if they want as well. So you can get it from indie bookshops. But yeah, the Evil website, unfortunately, kind of is a good place. And then this is the sequel that I was talking about, which is coming out on the 22nd of April. So yeah, and this is all about Pablo Fanque and the Victorian Circus. So yeah, but my website and yeah, my Instagram, which is Claire_Linney, are definitely the best places to find me.
Yes, and all the links will be in the description below.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've had such a lovely time talking to you. It's been absolutely lovely. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.